Okay, tonight we're standing in the middle of a silent field in Bavaria. The air is heavy, the wind cuts through the darkness, and somewhere beneath this soil lies a story that refuses to rest. 6 lives ended here, on a lonely farm called Hinterkaifeck. Yet a century later, the question of who killed them still bleeds into the present. Welcome to Criminal Mindcast, the podcast where we tell true crime stories not just with facts, but with silence, with the haunting weight of what was never said. We listen for the pauses, the contradictions, and the quiet truths that only time can reveal. Tonight, we open one of Europe's most enduring unsolved mysteries, a cold case that blends fear, isolation, and the human mind's capacity to fracture. This is the story of the Hinterkaifeck Farmhouse murders and the darkness that never left. In 1922, Bavaria was still learning to breathe again after the war. Fields lay quiet under frost, soldiers returned with hollow eyes, and the countryside spoke in whispers rather than sentences. Among those whispers stood a small, weathered farmhouse at the edge of Groben, a place known as Hinterkaifeck. To most, it was just another patch of land surrounded by pine and silence. But to those who lived nearby, that silence carried a strange pulse, a sense that something inside that house was not quite right. The Gruber family lived in isolation on their farm. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, was a man hardened by labor, rigid, severe, and unbending in his sense of order. His wife Cecilia, frail and subdued, had long surrendered to his dominance. Their daughter, Victoria Gabriel, a widowed mother of 2, had returned home after her husband's death in the war. Her young daughter shared her grandmother's name. Her infant son, Joseph, was the focus of hushed speculation about his true father. Villagers who visited spoke of the heavy stillness inside the house, a silence charged with unease. Andreas's piercing stare unsettled even the bold, while Victoria's trembling church songs seemed to conceal both sorrow and shame. Rumors circulated of cruelty, of secrecy, and of something unspoken yet deeply wrong. The story goes that Andreas Gruber had once been convicted of an incestuous relationship with his daughter Victoria. Both served short prison sentences. When Victoria returned home, the shadow of that scandal never lifted. The villagers looked away, perhaps out of politeness, perhaps out of fear. In small towns, silence is often the price of belonging. Psychologically, the Grubers existed within a closed system, a family consumed by its own gravity. In modern terms, it was an environment of coercive control and learned helplessness. Andreas, with his authoritarian nature, ruled through fear disguised as order. Victoria, bound by duty and shame, moved between rebellion and resignation. And Cecilia, the aging matriarch, lingered as a quiet observer in a home of unspoken wounds. The isolation of Hinterkaifeck deepened their fractures. Surrounded by fields and forest, miles from the nearest village, they lived on the edge of society, both physically and emotionally. Winter pressed harder there. Nights stretched longer. In that silence, imagination could turn cruel. Every creak, every sigh of wind became a possible threat. In psychology, this state is called hypervigilance, the mind feeding on itself in the absence of external connection. Weeks before the murders, strange events began. Andreas reported footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the barn, but none returning. A key went missing. At night, they heard footsteps in the attic, though no one was found. The family's maid soon quit, claiming the house was haunted. Voices in the walls, objects moving on their own. For 6 months, the Grubers lived without help, until a new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived on March 31, 1922. It was her first and last night alive. From a forensic psychology perspective, these incidents reveal escalating paranoia and perhaps surveillance. Whether real or imagined, the family sensed an unseen presence. The missing key, the attic noises, the footprints, all eroded the fragile boundary between fear and fact. When the human mind faces patterns it cannot explain, it fills the gaps with dread. That is how fear becomes prophecy. In rural communities like Groben, social control was maintained not by law but by rumor. People knew everything and nothing at once. They decided who belonged, who sinned, who bore the town's shame. The Grubers were tolerated, never accepted. Victoria's supposed affair with neighbor Lorenz Schlittenbauer deepened the gossip. Some said he was the father of her young son, Josef. Others claimed jealousy and obsession drove him. Whispers spread that Andreas forbade Victoria to remarry, keeping her under his control. The emotional landscape of the farmhouse was suffocating. Long nights lit by an oil lamp, wind pressing against the shutters, words left unsaid. That silence was not peace, but pressure, the weight of years of control and fear. In trauma psychology, such an environment breeds intergenerational trauma. Pain passed not through words, but through behavior. Victoria's daughter, little Cecilia, reportedly told a classmate she saw things her mother didn't, faces in the shadows, sounds no one else heard. Whether imagination or something real, it fits the pattern. The house seemed alive, pulsing with dread. It's easy now to treat these fragments as omens, but at the time no one acted. No one called the police. No one intervened. This is where moral philosophy meets tragedy, when fear of judgment outweighs the instinct to protect. In Stoic thought, indifference becomes complicity. In Christian terms, it is sin by omission. And so the family remained in their silent world, bound by shame, isolation, and secrets too heavy to name, until the night when silence finally broke, not with words, but with blood. The Gruber family carried on with their routines, tending to livestock, attending church, clinging to normalcy in a place that no longer felt safe. But the human mind is not built to endure constant fear. When threat lingers, it reshapes perception. Patterns appear in randomness, menace hides in every sound. The Grubers had entered what psychologists call anticipatory anxiety, a dread not of what has happened, but of what must come. Hinterkaifeck became a stage for this invisible tension, a man unable to surrender control, a daughter caught between shame and survival, a village bound by silence. And beyond the tree line, perhaps in the forest, perhaps above the ceiling, an unseen watcher waited. Whether he was real or merely the echo of collective guilt, no one can say. By early spring, as the snow began to recede, the farmhouse stood like an island holding its breath. Passers-by said it looked darker than before, as if the house itself anticipated what was coming. Andreas, proud and unyielding, dismissed all warnings. Yet in psychology, denial often marks the final stage before collapse. At Hinterkaifeck, that fragile line was about to break. The final days of March 1922 unfolded like a slow tightening of breath. Hinterkaifeck sat beneath a low sky, the snow half melted into mud, the air still sharp with winter's memory. To those who passed along the nearby path, the farm seemed unchanged, yet inside something had already begun to fracture. Neighbors would later recall small disturbances that in isolation seemed harmless. The family dog barking deep into the night, its chain clattering until dawn, footsteps echoing above the ceiling when everyone was asleep, tools moved, doors left ajar. Andreas Gruber once again discovered footprints in the snow, a single trail from the forest to the barn, with none returning. He told neighbors someone was watching them. They urged him to alert the police, but Andreas, proud and unyielding, dismissed it. He had endured war and disgrace. He would not bow to unseen fears. On the night before the murders, a storm swept through Hinterkaifeck. Wind howled across the fields, masking sounds that might have carried in still air. Victoria locked the doors carefully, soothing her restless children, while the dog growled at something unseen beyond the window. The next morning, a new maid, Maria Baumgartner, was to begin work, replacing the servant who had fled months earlier, claiming the house was haunted. March 31st, 1922 would be her first and final night. Investigators later reconstructed an unnerving sequence of events. Sometime late that evening, Andreas heard a sound in the barn. Perhaps the animals, perhaps something else. Taking a lantern, he went to investigate. He was the first to die, struck by a mattock, a heavy farming tool, with devastating force. His wife, Cecilia, likely followed, searching for him or responding to the commotion. She too was killed instantly. Victoria came next, her defensive wounds showing brief resistance before the final blow. Then came 7-year-old Cecilia, led or carried into the barn. She did not die immediately. Strands of her own hair were later found clenched in her hands. Inside the farmhouse, the killer continued with chilling precision. He found the new maid, Maria, in her room, likely preparing for bed. A single strike ended her life. Last was baby Joseph, asleep beside his mother. He never woke. 6 lives ended within minutes, yet what followed remains most disturbing. The killer stayed. For days the farm appeared alive. The animals were fed. Smoke rose from the chimney. Fresh meals appeared on the table. Neighbors passing by assumed the Grubers were simply keeping to themselves after the storm. But inside that quiet house, death had already settled, and the murderer had made himself at home. Psychologists studying the case describe this behavior as post-crime occupation, a rare phenomenon where the perpetrator inhabits the environment of the victims as if absorbing their existence. It can signify possession, delusion, or a profound lack of empathy. In certain cases, it reflects a ritualistic need for control, a killer asserting dominion over both the bodies and the space that once gave them meaning. Whoever stayed at Hinterkaifeck slept in their beds, ate their food, and tended their animals. It was as if the murderer wanted to erase the distinction between life and death, to merge with what he had destroyed. There is something deeply psychological in that act, a blurring of self and other guilt and satisfaction. In Freudian terms, it echoes the concept of thanatos, the death drive, an unconscious compulsion toward destruction that masquerades as order. Days passed. The mailman delivered letters to the house, noticing the windows shuttered, but assuming nothing unusual. The milkman left his delivery at the door. It wasn't until April 4th, when little Kazilia failed to attend school and the family missed Sunday church service, that neighbors grew uneasy. A search party was organized. When they entered the barn, they found the bodies beneath straw and hay, stacked neatly. The sight was not chaotic, it was deliberate. The arrangement suggested calculation, perhaps even remorse disguised as order. The killer had covered them but not hidden them, as if acknowledging their death but not denying it. Inside, the investigators found the maid and the infant in their beds. Nothing appeared stolen, though large sums of money lay in plain sight. This eliminated robbery as a motive. Instead, the atmosphere felt ritualistic, each act of violence executed with a precision that hinted at emotional connection rather than random cruelty. The timeline grows disturbingly precise. After the murders, the killer remained in the farmhouse long enough to cook meals, stoke the fire, and feed the animals. Witnesses later swore they saw smoke curling from the chimney days after the family vanished. One neighbor recalled the rhythmic sound of an axe striking wood inside the barn on April 1st, as though life at Hinterkaifeck continued, but without the living. Modern profiling would classify this as organized psychopathy, a pattern marked by composure, control, and ritualistic precision. Such individuals linger not out of panic, but to extend their dominance. The farmhouse became a psychological stage, transformed into a place where power, fear, and death intertwined. When police finally entered, the air felt heavy, as if the house itself resisted intrusion. The animals were agitated but alive. The scent of cooked food mingled with decay. On the table lay crumbs of bread, traces of meat, and beside the hearth a recently stirred fire, evidence of someone who had made themselves at home. No weapon was ever recovered, no fingerprints matched, only footprints leading into the snow, fading into the woods, then vanishing entirely. The horror of Hinterkaifeck endures not just in its brutality, but in its closeness. The work of someone who knew the Grubers and moved among them as one of their own. When smoke rose from the chimney days later, it was more than proof someone remained inside. It became a symbol, the farm itself still breathing after death, releasing quiet whispers of what had happened within. Each curl of smoke carried secrets no one would ever truly comprehend. By the time the police arrived at Hinterkaifeck, the house had already become a spectacle. The first officers stepped into chaos, villagers crowding around the barn, neighbors whispering prayers or taking morbid curiosity in the scene. Children peered through windows while adults rummaged through rooms, touching objects that should have remained untouched. What could have been a clean investigation dissolved within hours. Evidence was trampled into the mud, fingerprints smeared, timelines blurred. The crime scene, one of Germany's most significant, began already compromised. The investigators found themselves overwhelmed. In 1922, rural Bavaria was far from equipped with the forensic sophistication we now take for granted. There were no crime scene photographs taken before the bodies were moved, no proper autopsy environment, no secured perimeter. The villagers meant no harm, perhaps. They were simply drawn by the irresistible pull of tragedy. But their presence transformed the farmhouse into something unrecognizable, a theater of confusion where truth drowned in human noise. From the beginning, suspicion drifted through the village like seeds on the wind. The first theory was simple. A vagrant or thief had stumbled upon the farm, yet nothing was stolen. Money sat untouched. Valuables remained in plain sight. The motive, it seemed, was not greed. It was something far more personal. Attention soon turned to Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor and former suitor of Victoria. He had been among the first to discover the bodies, and his ease within the farmhouse unsettled onlookers. Witnesses said he walked confidently through the rooms, even fed the livestock as investigators watched. To some it was compassion, to others an eerie display of guilt. When questioned, Lorenz defended himself logically. Someone had to tend to the animals. But logic rarely quiets emotion once suspicion takes root. Psychologically, a community under stress seeks a vessel for its fear. The mind craves resolution, even if it arrives through error, a process known as cognitive closure. In Hinterkaifeck, Lorenz fit the archetype perfectly: the rejected lover, the rumored father of the child, the man with access and motive. It all aligned too neatly. Yet the evidence remained elusive. No weapon, no bloodstains, no confession. Eventually he was released, and the void of certainty deepened. The next theory pointed outward, toward the chaos left by war. Bavaria in 1922 was teeming with displaced soldiers, veterans broken by combat, drifters hardened by violence. Perhaps one of them had reached Hinterkaifeck, driven by hunger, rage, or madness, but this too dissolved without proof. Then came the strangest whisper, that Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, reported killed in action, had never truly died. Some claimed he returned in secret, bent on vengeance. Records disproved it, yet the story persisted. In the realm of fear, myth often outlives truth. The press, sensing fascination, fueled the fire. Newspapers called it the farmhouse of death, printing grainy photos and speculative diagrams of the murder scene. Journalists arrived from Munich, some inventing details to fill the gaps left by police incompetence. The story sold well. Germany, weary from post-war hardship, found in Hinterkaifeck a symbol of something darker than hunger or politics. It was evil stripped of reason, the embodiment of what philosopher Hannah Arendt would later call the banality of evil, violence without ideology, cruelty without cause. As days turned to weeks, the investigation lost momentum. Files piled up, suspects came and went, and the silence of the farmhouse grew heavier. In the absence of justice, folklore began to take root. The villagers spoke of ghosts wandering the fields, of the dog howling every year on the anniversary, of lantern lights seen near the ruins long after the house was demolished. What had begun as a police case was evolving into legend, a moral parable about isolation, sin, and the dangers of secrecy. Decades later, forensic experts revisited the evidence. By then, the farmhouse was gone, replaced by a memorial stone and open field. Yet fragments of the crime remained preserved in archives: photographs of the victims, sketches of the barn, blood-stained clothing stored in boxes. Modern analysts found inconsistencies that had been overlooked: unknown fingerprints on doors, a missing key that was never accounted for. An untraceable mattock head discovered years later in a neighbor's attic, rusted and incomplete. Even with advanced methods, no definitive match emerged. Every discovery only deepened the mystery. In criminology, unsolved cases often reveal more about the investigators than the perpetrator. The errors at Hinterkaifeck reflected not only procedural failure, but psychological denial. No one wanted to believe such violence could come from within their own community. It was easier to imagine a stranger, a drifter, a soldier, a ghost, than to accept that the killer might have shared their church pew or bartered at their market. The longer the investigation stretched, the more the case transformed into a collective mirror. The villagers began to turn inward, suspicion corroding the fragile trust of small-town life. Doors that had once been left unlocked were now bolted. Conversations grew shorter. Smiles faded. Even after the police left, the fear remained. Quiet, enduring, embedded in daily routine. Distrust became habit. By the time the official files were closed, Hinterkaifeck was no longer a place. It was an idea. It represented the unspeakable truth that evil can emerge not from outsiders but from the ordinary, from people who sit across the table, from minds that appear stable but are quietly unraveling. As generations passed, the story endured not through memory, but through myth. The farmhouse of death became a cautionary tale told to children, a ghost story whispered in the dark. Yet beneath the folklore lies the real terror, not the murders themselves, but the silence that followed. The silence of neighbors who looked away, the silence of a society that preferred mystery over accountability. In the end, the investigation revealed nothing certain. But perhaps that is why the story continues to haunt, because what unsettles us most is not the presence of evil, but the absence of understanding. From a trauma psychology perspective, the Hinterkaifeck murders were not born out of sudden madness, but out of accumulation, years of silence, repression, and emotional decay. The Gruber family lived in near-total isolation, miles from the nearest village, surrounded by forests and fields that swallowed sound. In such solitude, thoughts begin to echo. Paranoia grows roots. Guilt and shame ferment like rot beneath the surface of civility. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, was known as a strict, domineering man, hard on his family, harder still on himself. Whispers of abuse circulated even before the murders, incest between Andreas and his daughter Victoria. Forbidden and yet tolerated through the inertia of shame. To outsiders, the Grubers were private. To those who dared look closer, they were fractured. If those rumors held truth, then Hinterkaifeck was less a home than a sealed chamber of psychological tension, where love, duty, and sin intertwined until the distinctions collapsed. Psychologists might describe this as familial entrapment, a dynamic in which isolation intensifies the family's internal hierarchies and secrets. In environments like these, reality bends to fit the logic of the abuser or the silence of the victims. It's a pattern seen across history. When voices cannot escape, violence finds another way to speak. But when we look beyond the Grubers, one question lingers. Did the horror emerge from within those walls, or did something far colder and unseen find its way in from the world outside? Many researchers believe the killer was familiar with the property, someone who knew the animals, the layout, the habits of each family member. The crime displayed a chilling degree of patience. To lure 6 people one by one into a barn requires not only control but intimacy. It suggests knowledge of their trust, their fears, their routines. That kind of insight rarely comes from a stranger. Others argue the opposite, that the killer was an outsider driven by revenge, perhaps by the rumors surrounding the family's moral decay. The theory suggests an external force, a symbolic cleansing, a punishment enacted upon a household seen as cursed or corrupt. This interpretation paints the murderer not as mad, but as a moral executioner twisted by delusion, projecting righteousness onto brutality. Psychologically, both explanations share a common root, the killer's mindset born from secrecy and shame. Whether inside or outside, the act at Hinterkaifeck reveals the same mechanism, a collapse of empathy under the weight of suppressed emotion. Shame, when unacknowledged, often mutates into aggression. The mind, seeking to destroy what it cannot confront, externalizes guilt into violence. What's chilling about Hinterkaifeck is that the killer didn't flee. For days after the murders, someone lived there, feeding the livestock, lighting fires, eating from the family kitchen. This detail defies rational comprehension, but in psychological terms, it may signify a ritual of control. Killers who remain at the crime scene often seek to rewrite the narrative, to undo the chaos they've unleashed by imposing new order. It's as if they wish to erase the boundary between victim and perpetrator, to live within both roles simultaneously. Some locals whispered that the murderer never left, that he continued living nearby, haunted by guilt, yet comforted by silence. In small communities, silence is both shield and weapon. To admit suspicion is to break social bonds. To stay quiet is to preserve them. Perhaps the killer depended on that silence. Perhaps everyone did. Decades later, interviews with surviving relatives and townsfolk reveal a pattern of avoidance. People claimed not to remember details, not to have heard the rumors, not to have been close to the Grubers. But collective forgetting is itself a psychological defense, a way for communities to contain trauma without confronting it. The unsolved nature of the case became its own kind of equilibrium. As long as no one knew the truth, everyone could remain innocent. In this sense, the mystery of Hinterkaifeck is not simply who did it, but why the question persists. The human mind struggles with unfinished stories. We crave closure not for justice but for peace. And when that closure never comes, we turn the story into myth. Myths comfort us by transforming horror into meaning, but this myth resists even that. It refuses to offer moral clarity. Theories continue to multiply. A deranged farmhand, a secret lover, a soldier returned from the dead. But every hypothesis reveals more about our own psychology than about the killers. We invent narratives to distance ourselves from the possibility that such horror could emerge from ordinary life. Because if the murderer was one of them, then perhaps he could be one of us. In criminal psychology, there's a term for this unease: the proximity of evil. It describes the discomfort we feel when violence originates from familiarity, when the boundary between the normal and the monstrous dissolves. Hinterkaifeck embodies that idea completely. Its terror is not the blood in the barn, but the recognition that the murderer's footsteps might once have walked beside yours, unnoticed, unremarkable. The farmhouse was eventually torn down. The land, leveled and cleared, returned to quiet. But those who visit say the place still feels heavy, as if the soil remembers. Every gust of wind seems to carry whispers. Every silence feels occupied. It's not superstition, perhaps, but resonance, the lingering psychological weight of unresolved trauma. Nearly a century later, the story of Hinterkaifeck still unsettles, not merely because the murders remain unsolved, but because they expose something timeless in human nature. The farmhouse is less a crime scene than a mirror, reflecting how isolation and silence can distort the human psyche. In that quiet, love can curdle into control, fear into obsession, and order into violence. The tragedy endures because it speaks to the thin, fragile boundary between the rational and the monstrous within us all. Why they did it remains the haunting question, hovering between truth and terror. Perhaps it was never meant to be answered at all, only understood through the lingering chill it leaves behind. A century has passed, yet the name Hinterkaifeck still lingers in Germany, as collective memory like a wound that refuses to heal. The farmhouse is gone, but the silence remains, a silence that hums with questions no one can answer. Perhaps the truth was never buried by time, but by fear. Fear of what it might reveal about the human heart when stripped of pretense, left alone in the cold. Every unsolved mystery reminds us that evil is rarely a stranger. It grows quietly, nourished by shame, secrecy, and denial, until it finally breaks through the walls we build to contain it. If fear is a mirror, what does it show you when you dare to look? If you found this story meaningful, remember to like, share the video, and subscribe for more. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.